Right, well, welcome everybody. This is a training session on qualitative coding put together by a combination of BGI Nexus and the Ambassador Programme's AI Ethics Workgroup. And it's nice to see so many people here on an event that we thought might be a little bit niche, but it's certainly useful information for all sorts of applications in the kinds of qualitative research that we might do. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Esther Galfalvi and Maria Lagatina to tell us a bit more.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting us to this session. It's really exciting to be able to share what we've been up to and what we've been doing, and to share any insights that might be helpful for people going forward who might be doing some research either in the Ambassador program or anywhere else in the ecosystem. Yeah, so just a bit of background. I suppose we kicked off a research project with the ambassadors and with the help of the AI ethics work group as part of BGI Nexus's initiative towards creating beneficial AGI. And one of the cornerstones, let's say, of that initiative is to make sure that people are included and people's voices are heard all over the world in how we develop AI, and making sure that there is a diversity of voices in the input into how we develop AI in the future. So we kicked off a research project to find out people's feelings about the future of AI, what they would prefer AI not to do, what their hopes and fears are, just to kind of give a deeper understanding of the landscape of how people feel and what their expectations are going forward. So as part of that, we designed some methods like data collection methods like interviews and surveys. And the ambassadors did some interviews to collect data from individuals through one-to-one interviews, and I think occasionally in pairs to add a depth of our insights to our understanding of how people feel about AI. So they went to their local communities and they talked to people one-to-one and did recordings, and we transcribed those interviews. And the coding is what happens to those interviews after that data is collected. So I thought I'd give a little general intro into what is coding. Coding is when you have an interview or you have a big piece of unstructured text data, you tag it with smaller pieces of text. So it's part of sense making. So what do people think? What do people do? What surrounds that phenomenon, in this case, AI? And its structures are understanding. So how do we organize all of that data so that it makes sense and so that we can find out what we want to know? So why do we do coding? Well, as I've explained, it's part of research. What kinds of research are there that coding and interviews are good for? Excuse me, it's good for market research, for stakeholder research, more academic kinds of research like education and social science. But fundamentally, it helps us to understand what people have said, how they experience phenomena. Things like social science and education research help us to understand how, for example, how people learn, or how they personally experience injustice, how they experience the systems that structure our lives, that sort of thing. And then market research, for example, helps us to understand what people want out of products. What do they want in services? What do they find particularly challenging? Where do they experience the most friction when they're experiencing a product? And then stakeholder research is about finding out what people who are at all involved in that topic are experiencing. I think I'm going to share some slides now. Just a moment. And you will see my screen.
Yep.
Great. So yeah, as you can see, so here are the different types of research it's good for. So yes, it helps us to understand what people have said. And it's particularly useful for what we're trying to find out here, where we have a kind of mixture, really. In this project, to find out how people feel about AI, I consider it a combination of something like social science and stakeholder research. Social science because it helps us to understand how people experience things, and how the systems that we are creating and the big corporations and governments and regulators are creating are impacting people. And also stakeholder research, because I think I've probably said several times before, everybody on the planet is going to become or is already a stakeholder in how AI develops. Because in some way, either directly or indirectly, and knowingly or unknowingly, they are being impacted by AI. AI is making now decisions in larger systems. It's helping to support decision making at government level. It's helping to shape the landscape of commerce. So everyone in some way is now probably being impacted by AI on this planet. So that's why I consider it stakeholder research. So the research process, I'm just zooming out a little bit here to help understand where coding takes place. The research process is, first of all, you decide what you want to find out, and then you decide how you want to find it out. So do you want to use a survey? Do you want to use interviews? Do you want to watch the phenomenon, for example, like through classroom observation? Do you do a deep case study where you go into one institution and you see how things work, like an organization? Like if we wanted to map out how SingularityNET works, that would be in a deep way, and understand how it acts in the blockchain space or the AI space. That would be a case study. And then do you want to find it out using qualitative data or quantitative data or both? Quantitative data is essentially using numerical figures, so numbers, which is how you would, excuse me, you would get through surveys. And qualitative data is more unstructured data, more subjective data. How do people feel? What do they say? Coding belongs to qualitative data. So how do they think and feel? What are their experiences, and what does that tell us about the thing? So yes, broadly speaking, you define your question, you define your study, and choose your methods. In this case, we chose interviews and surveys. Our survey is still available and open to fill out, so as many people as possible. We'd love to hear from you about how you experience AI and how you think about the future of AI. And then you do your data collection, you collect your interviews and surveys, you clean your data. In surveys, that means that you filter out all the invalid responses, all the joke responses, because believe it or not, people do put funny responses in there sometimes, or ones that are so incomplete that they don't add anything to the data set, this sort of thing. And then you analyze your data. In this case, it's coding. And then finally, you write it up. You can collect mixed data in surveys, for example, so you can collect numerical data like on scales. A 1 to 5 scale, for example, is quite common, or 1 to 10 scale is quite common. And then you can have things like comment boxes. So comment boxes will be free text entries where people explain what they think about the answer to the question that you've asked them, and that you can code in the same way that you can code an interview. So coding an interview effectively involves having a piece of text in front of you, and then you choose parts of that text, and then you highlight it and then assign a code to it. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. So you have your, you tag with smaller pieces of text. So the types of data that we code, as I've said, the free text inputs on surveys, transcripts, and actually any kind of written material can be coded. And it depends a little bit on the methodology that you've chosen as to what kind of material you want to include in your study. But generally speaking, in some coding methodologies, you go and you code your interviews, you find out what you want from your interviews, and then you think to yourself, okay, so these concepts were quite interesting. I'm going to go on the web and I'm going to look at any literature around that might be useful to me. And then you can also code the literature, as long as you kind of separate it from the empirical data that you've collected and make sure that there is a distinction between those two types of data. It can add a lot of value to your study. And yes, so it helps to sense make and structure all of that unstructured information that you get when you have a conversation with somebody. So what happens after the interview? After the interview, you generally, if you've got a transcription tool, or if you're doing it by hand, first you anonymize the transcription. You check the transcript against the recording that you've made, and then once hopefully you've verified the accuracy of your transcript, then you start to code. And then once you have a bunch of codes already established, then you can start to categorize, and then you can do a kind of deeper analysis of what you found. So I'm going to jump ahead here for a moment. There are different kinds of coding approaches. So you can do bottom-up coding, which is called inductive coding, which is working from the data. So you look at your text and you let codes emerge from what the participants say. You don't put any kind of framework on it. You just look at the data and you think to yourself, okay, that looks like this sort of thing. And then you tag it, and then you edit them, and you go back and you change them when you change your mind. And it's a long, organic, and iterative process to code. So you collect everything that seems important about the topic, even if it wasn't in your plan. And that means that if you're working directly with the data, you can discover unexpected themes. Now, that contrasts a little bit with top-down coding, which is deductive coding. You start with your question. Rather than starting with the data, you start at the top with a question, which is, let's give a contrast. So a bottom-up coding question, research question, would be, how do people feel about AI? Whereas a top-down coding, a deductive question, is, do people feel afraid of AI? Slightly different framing of the question, very different kind of approach. So you start with your research question and you code specifically for things that help to answer it. So fear or no fear. That's really good when you need clear and targeted findings. That's much more helpful, for example, when you have a product. You say, does this product work the way it should? Or are you experiencing friction with the product? That kind of thing. So very kind of clear parameters to help you to understand whether your product is acting the way it should, and whether it suits the needs of your stakeholders. The bottom-up coding is much better if you don't fully know the terrain when it's about people's experiences and subjective experiences, because the less you interfere with the people's subjective experience, like the articulation, the less you put a framework on people's experiences, the more true to the data you stay, and the more authentically you can represent a plurality of views. I'm going to jump back. So why coding might be useful. You can identify themes. You can identify what are people's common experiences. So do people think the same thing? And where do people think differently? And in what context do people think differently from each other? So you might find that some people in a particular part of the world feel much more positively about AI, or they have particular fears that are related to their context, like it might take me away from my family, or it might reduce communication, or might be even good things, positive things, that it helps me to do things that otherwise I wouldn't be able to do. So finding out contextual information is really helpful. Coding facilitates that. And then one key aspect is that you can develop relationships between themes. So when do things coexist, like pressure and lack of support? So for example, in somebody's job, are they experiencing pressure? Well, they experience pressure when they have lack of support, or they have too many tasks at once, or their organization is not talking to them, this kind of thing. So, and as I said, you have these kind of contextual differences. So group differences, patterns by role, background, experience level, education level, part of the world they live in. All of those kinds of group differences can come because you can code cases according to where they are, who they are, and add any kind of data that you want in order to make more sense of what you're gathering. And you can also code for emotions and tone. Where do people feel confident? Where do they feel afraid? Where do they feel uneasy or anxious? And you can sometimes feel that as the interviewer and code for that in the data. So I'm just going to go to general levels. So you will find encoding codes. That's the smallest piece of text that you've got. A concept, which is a sort of grouping of those little codes, and then categories. Those are the top order codes that you end up with after you've gone through all of your data. So in inductive coding, the bottom-up coding, you would start with the codes and then develop the concepts from the codes, and then you would develop the categories from the concepts. So as a coding approach, you would start by distinguishing the little codes from the normal text. So that would be Gala, Pink Lady, Granny Smith, as little codes. You start to spot early patterns. Okay, so those are all types of apple. And then you group those codes, those concepts into categories. So once you might have another little box underneath the Gala, Pink Lady, and Granny Smith, and then you might have types of banana and types of pear. So those would be the higher order codes: apples, bananas, pears. And then you would be able to say, oh, I recognize those. Those are all fruits. And this essentially applies to the kinds of interview data that we're all collecting. So you can write little notes to yourself as well to help you along the way. Like if you're not sure about something and you want to remind yourself later to come back to that or change it, or remind yourself of an early idea that you had that may become relevant later. So I've included here a little diagram, which is, whoops. In fact, I think I'm going to stop sharing and share the. No, this is okay. Okay, so can you see the text okay? It's not too small?
It's great.
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay, great. So this is from my research into young people in the gig economy, where I was analyzing interviews based on I was analyzing interview data, answering the question of what do young people who are teenagers think about platform work while they're still at school, because I wanted to know whether young people felt optimistic about platforms like Uber or Deliveroo, or these kind of automated platforms where there is a machine essentially automating the matching of work. So do people feel good about it? Do young people feel like it's the future of work? I wanted to know what they experienced and whether they're actually using it as well. So I did 12 interviews with groups of young people, and I coded those interviews using a thematic analysis, starting with the smallest code. So I used an inductive approach using the smallest codes first. And can you see my cursor if I'm moving it around, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Okay, great. So these on the left-hand side, you see here the little codes here on the side: easy, spare time activity, extra money, flexible, temporary, low commitment. So to me, all of those fell into a concept: casual work. And that was, and then you've got anyone can do it. You can just pick it up. Don't need any qualifications. It's convenient. To me, that implied accessibility. And so you have these second order codes here, and they all group nicely into these are the characteristics of platform work that young people were finding. Things like low quality, it's not very secure, it's autonomous, it might not be safe. If you work for Uber, are you going to be attacked in your vehicle? It's insecure, you could be terminated, your contract could be terminated at any time, you can be kicked off the app, and so on. And then on this other side, we have a high order category of suitability. Who is it good for? These are the types of people that it's good for. It's instrumental, so it's a kind of practically suitable thing, and it's not really for a career, because I was looking at it from a career perspective. There are many ways to code data. This is not the only one. I suppose I was putting together a number of different approaches. So I included a number of different coding approaches for what I was doing, and I sort of sense checked it with my research team. So that's one thing that you can do. You can always have a second pair of eyes or a third pair of eyes looking at your data. But hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Are there any questions so far? Because I've dumped a lot of information at you very quickly, so I'm just wondering if there are any questions so far.
Of course, I had one.
Go ahead, Charlie, please.
It strikes me that the coding itself, the act of coding, is almost an art form, and that it would, like, one of the important pieces of data would be, if you have multiple coders, which coder did the coding on each. And so I don't know whether the practical, right? Obviously, you can build up a protocol for coding on a specific project and hopefully have the different coders follow that sort of direction. But I was wondering, like, obviously it's a huge time sink, but to have all the coders code everything redundantly might be the best practice if that's practical. But otherwise, it just strikes me that if you have two different people doing the coding, you might get very different results. And, at some point, can coding be done by an AI? I don't know. So, a lot of interesting questions.
Yes, it's funny that you should ask the AI question. We are going to come to that a bit later, but I'll answer your initial question first. And that's, yes, absolutely. There is a huge amount of subjectivity to coding. Like how I interpret it will be very different from how somebody else interprets it. So I would say that first of all, that can be a feature rather than a bug, because having two people who look at things from two different perspectives can actually be better. That if somebody might miss something because of their own contextual framing, and so having somebody who, for example, might be from the stakeholder group could be really helpful if it is indeed only one stakeholder group. And something that the interviewers seemed to find was that it mattered. It made a big difference, a potentially positive difference when they were from the same culture as the interviewee. So the perspective of the individual really makes a very big difference, and having multiple perspectives in the interpretative process, I think, is generally a positive thing. Now, how do you merge those two things? Well, I think it's probably just intuitively. I think there are many ways to approach this, but intuitively, it feels to me that if you've got two different people or multiple people doing it, then they should start independently and then come together and talk through what they found and their interpretations to see whether they agree and how to represent their different perspectives in the write-up. Vani, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, Charlie, I thought it was dead interesting that you said, oh, it's like an art form. I just wanted to throw in a little bit of like sideways experience. It is often used in art itself. As an artist, I've often made kind of sound installations based on oral history material and coded to kind of, in an inductive way, but maybe slightly less formal way than you would for a research project. And yeah, it really can reveal unexpected meanings. But one thing I was going to say on the question of different people will code in different ways. In research work, I've often found it useful to take the categories back to the research subjects as a way of verifying, particularly if they're a group rather than a load of individuals, to go back and go, all right, these are the categories that I've sort of derived from the material. Do these feel like they make sense?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. It's really good in however the coding was done to take it back, if you can, to the stakeholder group and see how they feel about what you found, whether they experience it in the way that you've reported it. Sometimes it's just not possible though, isn't it? Sometimes if it's individual interviews, it can be rather difficult to, like, one person's interpretation of your results might not be the same as somebody else's, or in this particular case, I couldn't go back into the schools because the schools are time poor, and the students might not even really have remembered the interview and so on. Yeah, sometimes you can't go back into the institutions or organizations where you did the original research, but where possible, especially with the kind of more sensitive research, it's great to go back and talk to the people and compare what you found and what you interpreted with their experiences. Just trying to remember where I was in my presentation. Are there any other questions before we go back to coding workshop? Is it clear from the diagram roughly how it works? So you see that these are sometimes you can have codes that are called in vivo codes. So it's when you take a direct quote from somebody and you use it as one of your smallest codes. And quite a lot of that is what I have in these little codes here. So when somebody said it's on the side, or it's easy, or anyone can do it, or you can just pick it up, all of those are things that they actually said. Because I really enjoy kind of putting together as closely as possible what somebody said from the text, and then putting those into concepts and categories. I like to stay very close to the data because I feel that it more accurately represents what people feel, rather than trying to interpret these lower, smallest order codes. I think it's more helpful to stay pretty close. It does mean that it's a bit less formal, but I think it's also quite understandable to anybody looking at the diagram. How did you actually arrive at this? So in a certain way, it can help traceability too if you stay very close to the data. So there are different types of coding. I'm just going to go into this at a very high level. I won't go too deeply into it. But if we want a deeper workshop on how to do it practically, then I'm absolutely happy to do that. We can come back another day to do some real, get involved in real coding and maybe do some research together. For now, we've got descriptive coding, so that's a short label that summarizes information. And I just mentioned in vivo coding, so using the exact words verbatim as the code. Process coding, what's happening. And emotion and values coding captures feelings, beliefs, and priorities. So these would often look slightly different in your coding structure because they're sort of in some cases they're meta commentary on what's going on. So they're not about what people said, but what people seem to be projecting as emotions, or how we're kind of evaluating the beliefs and priorities. And then you have pattern focused coding, which is starting to resolve them into their concepts and categories. What kind of tools do we have for coding? Well, Maria has been working very hard on transcribing the interviews and starting to code the interviews. So Maria Lagutina has joined us at SingularityNET as an intern, has been doing excellent work with this study, and has been helping to process all of the data, and has been experiencing firsthand what's happening in these interviews. And as part of the project, she was evaluating the different types of tooling that are available to code software. To code interviews. And you'll hear in a moment from Maria her experiences that she had while she was coding and what she found. The tooling that's available is kind of variable across the market. This isn't a comprehensive list, of course. This is just the ones that we tried out. We don't have to use tools, and in some cases, in some schools have thought it's actually worse to use a tool because it can structure things too early and can impact how you perceive the data. And so in that case, you sit with all of your printouts and you use a highlighter or post-its, and you kind of spread yourself out in a room or on your desk or something with all of your pens and your thinking. But here we used Qualcoder, Deduce, and NVivo to trial out. There are two here that are free, so Qualcoder and Deduce are free softwares. But of course, they have their downsides. So it makes research extremely accessible, or makes coding very accessible to anybody who wants to do it. Yeah, Bernie, exactly. For audio material, you listen and listen and listen. That's absolutely right. Walk while listening. Potentially walk while listening. Um, just a little chat conversation. Yes, so the free softwares make coding very, very accessible to anyone, which is great, because anyone anywhere with a computer can start using it. I think it's available on mobiles as well at times. Um, the disadvantages are, of course, that they have less money to work on their products. So Qualcoder is a bit laggy, fewer features generally, and sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive to try to understand the user interface. Deduce is a subscription version. It's online. There are a few that are kind of just online tools. And again, it's not as intuitive as some of the paid for softwares, but is really good for collaboration. And then NVivo is a full paid version. It's usually included in most university subscriptions in the UK. But it's pretty expensive and can be a bit laggy, depends. Some of the older versions can be a bit better in that respect. And it's really good for kind of marshalling all in one big projects, and it's really good for different types of coding. So, for example, labeling cases by individual or by organization, or doing different types of coding, like from the table that we've done before. And it's got a nice kind of memoing interface as well. So it feels like, for the most part, you kind of get what you pay for, but at the same time, there are pluses and minuses to each one. And anyone who's aiming to get into coding doesn't need to pay necessarily to do that, and can explore any of the free softwares. There are other free softwares as well, not just this one, but these were the three that that Maria did the deep dive into. This is a real example from Maria's research. So I was just wanted to go into concretely what was from the research, and she'll go into it as well in a moment. You can see here that we've got these kind of second order categories of AI adoption, AI being able to improve life, things like feelings about AI, giving AI human roles. And these are the little pieces of text that have been coded within Marie, is this one NVivo, or which one is this? Or is this one Deduce?
This one is Qualcoder.
Okay. I quite like the mind map visual. The other one, the other example that we had earlier, was a mind map that I built myself. That wasn't an output of the software, but in some of them they do it for you. So in the reports they create your mind map for you, which I think is a neat tool. I'm going to give you back your slide, Maria. I'm so sorry. I think I've placed it somewhere else.
I think it's at the top now.
Is it?
Yeah.
I've stopped sharing, haven't I? Is it at the top? Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. So we've touched on what coding is, what it's for, the types of coding there are, and what kinds of data we code. And now we're going to go into a real example of another real example of how coding can be useful in Qualcoder. And Maria is going to talk a little bit about her experiences doing it and her wonderful coding activities in the interviews that we've done with the ambassadors. And so you can see any ambassadors who are here who took part in the interview, and you can see this is what happens to your interviews after you've done them. Maria, do you want to share a presentation, or would you like me to do it and then move through? I think you've got it in front of you, so it may as well be you in charge of it, right?
Yeah, okay. I can share the screen. Okay. Oh. What's going on? Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to share a real example with one of our actual interviews. I'm going to explain step by step what I usually do and how much it takes me to code one interview. So as we mentioned, this is Qualcoder, which I think is quite useful, but sometimes, as we said, can be laggy. So let's start from beginning. The first step is very simple, just admin work. I open project, import the transcript that I get from Vani, and check that it's formatted in a way that's easy to work with. So at the start, we don't have any codes, any coloring, just a plain text. Then I normally do a quick read through, so I'm not coding completely cold. It helps me understand what the participant is mainly talking about. How does one feel about AI, about this interview, and so on. So after that, I start the actual coding process. I go through the transcript question by question, highlight a bit of text when I see that it's useful for us to code that data. For example, um, can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Yes, great. Let's have a look at this brown red-ish one. So in the interview, it says, if you do not accept this part, people are afraid of change. I know it's a bit of out of context, but the main thought here is that the participant believes people resist AI due to fear of change. And so once I see this data, I highlight it and I assign the code. Sometimes it's a code I already have. As you can see here, we have count. So how many times that code comes up in the interview, and sometimes it's a new one if the idea hasn't appeared before. As I'm coding, I'm also doing a small maintenance. If I notice two codes are basically the same, I make a note to merge them later. And if a code is becoming too broad, I flag it for splitting. By the end of the transcript, the output isn't just a conclusion of insights, it's a structured set of codes. So as you already seen this diagram. So this is called a tree map. It's very intuitive. It's basically a hierarchy where you can see parent codes and child codes. So the smaller specific ideas sit under broader categories. This is useful because it shows me what's already forming into theme level structure and what's still ungrouped. And that last part is normal too. Some codes don't have a category yet. I keep them as standalone codes for now. They're not wrong or useless. They're just waiting until I've coded more data and can see where they belong. So overall process from when I get the transcript until the first level of categorization takes me about 3 hours. But I actually enjoy the coding more than I expected because it feels like solving a puzzle for me. You're gradually building a map of what people are saying, but I guess it's different for everyone. At this stage, I don't want to present like this as a final result because coding is still in progress. But just I wanted to share things that I've learned throughout coding, both about interviews and about what kinds of patterns become visible once you start coding systematically. One of the strongest lessons is that the way question is phrased during an interview genuinely changes what kind of data you get back. Even when two questions are about the same topic, people answer differently, depending on whether the question invites examples, invites opinions, or invites a personal story. And closely related to that, follow-up questions really matter. They often unlock the most useful material. When someone gives a general answer, a follow-up like, can you give an example? Or what do you mean by that? Is where the detail appears, and that detail is what makes coding and theme building possible. An example of that would be, I've noticed a lot of people say in these interviews that AI helps optimization, but by the term optimization, they mean a lot of different things. It could mean that AI saves time for them, or saves resources, or reduces mistakes for them, takes off workload from them. So there are different values that matter to people, and that's what I find most interesting. So the questions that dig more of the specific information are the most useful, I think. And back to insights from the interviews, I don't want to go into too much details, but I thought why not share some of the things that keep coming up. For example, consent comes up as a core part of what people treat as ethics, not just whether something is legal, but whether people actively agree to the data or content being used, and whether they feel they still have control afterwards. Next one is that privacy isn't treated as a single rule. It's more like a set of conditions for trust. From an analysis point of view, this theme connects strongly to ideas like accountability, transparency, and who is responsible when boundaries are crossed. This also links to the next theme of people tending to trust AI more when they help to shape it. When the conditions for trust aren't clear, people tend to become cautious. When they are clear, they're more open to use of this technology. Another pattern that people are often comfortable with is AI being an assistant but not replacement, especially in areas where human judgment or empathy matters, like healthcare. And finally, I'm noticing that profession and AI experience level strongly influences what participants even mean when they say ethics. People aren't necessarily disagreeing on a single point. Sometimes they're using the same word, but talking about different underlying concerns. That's exactly the kind of thing coding helps make visible. And to be honest, getting to these patterns wasn't automatic for me. The process had a few consistent challenges that I'm going to share. Coding looks neat when it's presented as a finished diagram, as you all saw, but in practice, it's very messy at the start. One of the first challenges I faced was generalization in initial coding, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. In the beginning, it's very easy to create codes that are too broad because you're still learning what participants are really talking about and what matters most. But in the end, you will overcome it as you code more, you will improve your skills, and you will overcome this challenge. Another challenge is ambiguity. Some codes genuinely fit more than one code, especially when a participant is describing something complex or mixed. And that's okay. That's not always a mistake. It can actually be a sign that the data has real nuance, but it does make consistency harder. Also, staying consistent across transcripts was also a big challenge. Once you've coded a few interviews, you start to realize that two participants can describe the same idea in very different language, and you have to decide whether it belongs under one shared code or separate ones. And then there's always the tension between speed and depth. If you go too fast, you risk missing a lot of details. And if you go too deep, you can get stuck and never finish the data set. So I think at the start of my coding, the first ever interview took me way more than 3 hours. And but over time it improves. So what helped me keep the process under control, first of all, was reading through the interview without coding it straight away. So I get the idea of overall experience of the person, how they feel about AI in this case. Are they more hopeful or concerned about AI, etc.? Also, I would recommend always to step back a bit and do quick consistency checks. For example, returning to a short section later and seeing whether I would code it the same way, or even going back to other interviews to see if codes there share the same meaning, and ask myself if I need more precise codes, or can an already existing code be applied again. And of course, having a second set of eyes, even on a small sample, it was very valuable. It's a simple way to test whether the codes are understandable and whether my code definitions are clear, not just clear to me. So for me, I would ask Esther when I was unsure of the context, or we would go through some of my codes and see if they needed to be changed. And I think that's it from me. Now back to Esther.
Thank you so much for your insights. I really enjoy hearing other people's experiences of coding and data analysis. It's so great to hear other people's perspectives and the challenges that we share and the challenges that are different between us. It's great. Thank you so much, Maria, and thanks for all your hard work, because it's very hard work and in processing all of this data and to go through in such a rigorous way. You can see that it requires quite a lot of thinking and deep consideration. And I can see that you've really approached this in a very thoughtful way. Thank you. And I think it will really add to the study and the depth of what we've been doing here, really true to the spirit of what we're trying to find out about people's perspectives on AI. I'm going to come back now to Charlie's earlier question of, could we use AI for doing data analysis? And the answer is kind of. I don't think we can at present thoroughly, completely automate this process. Because, well, for various reasons. So it is really good at summarizing and pattern finding and categorizing, kind of, but not on its own, not without a human in the loop. It can't do things like prioritize relevance, especially according to context. So it can't always look at the data and hold the perspective, unless you specifically prompt it to every time. Hold the perspective of the context. It can't have the whole context, in fact, most of the time, because you might give it a geographical region or a culture, but there'll be a lot of connected areas that are part of that person's individual frame that may not be available to AI, and it may draw conclusions that are just inappropriate for that context. That's also true of an interviewer. It's not necessarily the case that an interviewer will be able to do that perfectly, or the person who is analyzing the data will not be able to do that perfectly necessarily. But there are intuitive leaps, and there are things that one can hold in one's mind about subjectivity that help to inform how that data is analyzed. And of course, there's a kind of iterative process as well. So you can hold in your mind as you're analyzing, just as Maria described before, what did I code this as? Does it need to be recoded? Questioning your own research process and having that kind of meta questioning of the research process is profoundly important, because it allows you to make adjustments on the way, which is something that you could achieve with AI, but not just by putting a transcript in and asking it to analyze it. And And it also can't always resolve. In fact, it's not very good at resolving edge cases because it wants to generalize. It resolves into categories and generalizations a little bit too quickly. And also it doesn't always see what's not there. So you can start to see absences, but not all of them, I've noticed. So when I'm asking ChatGPT or Claude or something to analyze some piece of text, I tend not to put transcripts in it, but when I ask it to analyze text, it can observe some holes in it, but it won't identify all of the absences, and the absences are sometimes profoundly important because they represent differences between cultures. They represent power differentials, this kind of thing that isn't always apparent and won't always be apparent to an LLM. Where we start to put LLMs together with other tools, it'll be very interesting to see how much more accurate they become. So one reason why I don't think they're particularly helpful, it doesn't think, it's not present during the analytic process, so it processes it once, so you have to go through and iterate plenty of times in order to kind of get the things that you want to get out of it. And as I said, you can't really go back. It can't really go back and revisit its own thinking. There is a reflexivity involved in doing analysis as a researcher that isn't present in the AI because it isn't experiencing its subjective sense of self yet. Maybe later. Potential for hallucinations. It does this less and less, but I have noticed that there is an even larger danger in slight misinterpretations. And I discovered this when I put one of my research papers into AI and asked it to talk about it, essentially, and asked it to make summaries, and I was asking it to help me write my own research paper. And it was sort of insidious and rather dangerous because I was looking at it and thinking to myself, well, this is slight misinterpretation of what I've said. It overstates some things and understates other things. And so I feel like it's profoundly risky to ask the AI to do an analysis and be confident in the results, kind of take the results at face value, because there can be things in it that you don't necessarily pick up on because they're only slightly wrong, or that if you pass those results onto a different researcher who doesn't know the material as well, they just won't know it well enough to be able to identify the fact that there is an error in there. And an individual error is one thing, but then they can be cumulative and accumulate over time to misrepresent the situation in potentially quite profound ways. Fanny, go ahead.
I was just going to ask on that question of how it overstates some things and understates others. One thing I notice is that AI tooling will overstate anything to do with AI. So when you're researching about AI, that I don't know if you've noticed this, but if there is material that is directly about the question of, oh, can AI do this, or what is AI doing, it gets really focused on it.
Yeah, not optimal for a research question like this, is it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I suppose that's partially owing to how it's meant to behave as a model. If it's meant to be super helpful and super effective at everything and being ready to help you at all times, then it might try to overstate the helpfulness of AI in general. Interesting that over-presents in its analysis. I think I've covered edge cases before. It generalizes, it creates fast resolution, and it tries to resolve rather than differentiate when it's creating its results. How it can help, I think, is it is really useful to talk to it about the data, and it is really useful to talk to it about the analysis because sometimes it is brilliant at categorizing, but I find that it's only that helpful on a sort of more granular level. So if I'm trying to sharpen the categories, I've got three codes and they're sort of the same. What could they mean, or how could they be combined to make a concept? And I won't always take that at face value. You know, sometimes it's wrong or sometimes it's slightly different, but it will help to start thinking about codes or help to resolve them, because it is good at that sort of resolution, and so it can and that pattern matching and pattern identification is fantastic for shedding light or being able to kind of collate these things, but of course only with kind of supervision and really thinking about everything that it's said. And it can sometimes also, I mean, I've said that it's not good at identifying, or not always good at identifying absences, because some of them are so latent that they're not obvious. Oh, and one other thing that I didn't put in this presentation is that the LLMs will have their own biases, and they're not neutral at all. They are based on their own training data, and the training data has its own particular context, and is very well versed in conventional, traditional academic research methods. And it's important to remember, and it will have been trained on papers that do things a certain way and have the theoretical frameworks attached to them that that is already in existence. So the results from any kind of analysis will be skewed by all of that training data that can superimpose this artificial and quite hidden structure on the results. So I'm just trying to think of an example. If there, just as a really simple one, if there's loads of research out there that talks about people's experiences of AI being shaped by phenomenon A, then it's quite possible that ChatGPT will talk excessively about phenomenon A being part of people's experiences, even if your data doesn't necessarily reflect that. So it can turn up in odd little ways that that might not be obvious at first. So I think this will be rather difficult to fully iron out, except with very careful iteration with social scientists or experienced researchers who've done it many times before and can understand what's going on, and constantly comparing AI versions of analysis with human analysis. So I think that for a long time there's going to be the need for a human in the loop, because there are these huge holes and latencies in LLM analysis and in the data itself that make it rather difficult for LLMs and AIs to take over the process entirely in an automated fashion. Anecdotally, as a story, I was looking up, what was I looking up? Ethics values taxonomies. So as part of this research, I was thinking about how do AI organizations approach this? Have they approached this? And there is one AI organization that I'm not going to name because it's a big one. They created a taxonomy of human values about AI, and and they had done it using a corpus of their own chat with chatbots. And so people were chatting with the chatbots, and they took all of that data and they ran it through their own model, and then asked it to create the taxonomy of human values out of all of that data. Amazing that there is all of that data there. Terrible taxonomy with a lot of confusion between. It was about 3 levels of the taxonomy, which was categorization. So it was categorized in 3 levels in the same way that we do it here. And the categorization was terrible because there was a lot of mixing of levels. There were too many categories that I would have put in one. It was a huge mess, and is a terrible example of how research how LLMs can be used in research and then presented as sort of factual scientific findings. So I would caution anybody about just feeding data into an LLM and asking it to categorize using coding and then taking that as complete and accurate. That's a cautionary tale for you, children. um, just a bit of tongue in cheek there. No, I've made my share of mistakes with LLMs, and I'm very keen to see what happens actually next with all of the tooling that comes out with components like Hyperon, because I think that the iterative process can really be useful. I think that being able to talk to it about the data, and be able to kind of cross compare how humans analyze data with LLMs, I think all of that is really interesting, and I think it will really support research. But the human in the loop, as far as I'm concerned, is going to be needed there for quite some time. Otherwise, we risk kind of flattening people's experiences. And I think that's how we can help AI, by being part of this kind of iterative loop of learning. What do we bring to it? We bring the understanding of context and relevance. We bring abstraction, so our ability to kind of think outside of what the parameters of the question are, and we do the checking as well. So when often we use our intuition to do this sort of thing. So when something doesn't feel right, then we can go back and sense check what we had as a kind of gut feeling, and we can go back in person or on video calls or by email and verify with the people who are the subject. So those human connections back to the people that we talk to, I think, is profoundly important for research ethics, where we can. And until we have a kind of agentic AI who is able to go back and query with the research subjects, I don't think that it's going to be possible to replicate that. And even if we did, would people trust AI as an interviewer? That's an interesting research question for some other time, maybe. Would people trust an AI interviewer? And would we get the same sorts of results from an AI who is asking us questions? I think that would be kind of interesting to discover. So just to summarize, what does coding bring? It brings us structure, it brings us understanding, and it brings rigor and precision. So it allows the discussion, the study, to be grounded in the data, properly grounded in the data. Anyone who's interested in finding out more about how to do the kind of technical aspect of the coding, and wants to find out more about the tooling, learn how to use it, that sort of thing, absolutely would love to come back and do another session, or anyone who wants to get involved in more of the research, contact the ambassadors or contact us. We're always interested in expanding the research, and we're hoping to increase the reach of SingularityNET and deepen our understanding of how people feel about AI, and how people experience it, and their feelings and hopes and fears about it. And one day, maybe even the research will feed into a kind of values layer for AGI. The data that we have on the internet about people's values is very variable. It's kind of biased. The LLMs are pretty good to some degree at being able to predict human responses and understand human values, but there are missing pieces to that, important cultural differences and missing pieces to that, and that's the sort of depth that this kind of qualitative study adds. So that's why we're very keen to increase our reach, so that we can make a meaningful contribution to safety and ethics in AI in the global policy and regulatory space, and of course help to ensure that AI develops as beneficially and as possible, and contributes towards the flourishing of human life. So I can't emphasize enough how grateful I am to the Ambassador Program for doing all of these interviews, and contributing to our knowledge, and to Vani and Maria, Vani for coordinating and doing such a great job connecting us, and Maria for doing so much legwork with the coding of the interviews and interpretation. I'm so grateful to all of you. It's really wonderful to see this coming to fruition, and all the insights that are coming out of it. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming today to listen to me talk about coding. Are there any questions?
It's been great. Thank you.
It's not something that can be changed very much in the LLM itself, because it's a product of how that LLM fundamentally works, which is the statistical model. So the fact that it is selecting what is the statistically the next token means that it's always going to return to the middle of the curve and not look at the edge cases, whether that's what you're asking it to do, what you, Charlie, were asking it to do. You know, come up with, do something creatively rather than in a standard way, or whether that's to do with its findings or how it categorizes and prioritizes your findings. I feel like that's baked in fundamentally to how the model works, and so it would require some additional something, to possibly multiple additional somethings to kind of mitigate that. I mean, to be determined whether it's possible to add kind of reflective cycles in, that improve its capacity to do that. But it feels to me like things like training data and the way that it's trained can cause a kind of blind spot. It thinks it's being creative, but actually it's not able to be creative, and it's not even able to see that it's not being creative. And so you can't necessarily, the way that it is, ask it to look at its own biases. A bit like having not being able to kind of examine its own operating system or something. So because it's already fundamentally how it's structured.
Well, the other part that this brings up is that, as we build things out with Hyperon, right, is the importance of really curating the data that the LLM is trained on, right? So that it's not weighted in a certain way, right? Just taking in and dumping everything that you've gotten from the internet is going to give you a bias, right? The people who are most active online are a small subset of the population of the planet, and we're getting their words as you know as what the LLMs are reflecting back. And so how do we take care of that? It's a very hard problem to solve. It's going to take a lot of energy, but if we can somehow use information and maybe even the results of research like you're doing as sort of a core training of an LLM in the future, right, might be a way to mitigate this problem.
Funny if you got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, based on what you're saying, Charlie, I really would agree that it's not always that productive to just throw a shed load of data at an LLM and go make something of that. I'm wondering, with, research projects like this and kind of using AI in analysis, if you've got a reasonably large research corpus, some kind of a RAG process, and constraining it to look at the data you've got rather than just random training data. So rather than a kind of commercial LLM, maybe we're looking at a more constrained private AI tool.
Or even not even private, but just constrained, right? Let it be open.
Yeah.
People, weigh in on what else gets put in, but not just, I don't know. It's a tricky balance between, because having huge amounts of training data really does help the LLM work better. So how do we?
In some ways, and in some ways it doesn't, right?
Sure, sure. But how do we assemble more
Yeah.
really good, diverse training data rather than
Mm,
weighted towards
Absolutely.
happening
I
from that.
suppose, though, I'm just asking the question, like, what would happen if you constrained it just to look at your research corpus? Because obviously, as human researchers, we bring a lot of cultural background and insight to understanding that research data. But what would happen if you constrained the AI that you're using to make sure that it's not doing that at all and it's just looking almost a little bit self-reflexively at your research data alone? It would give a very different result, but it would be
I think you might have muted mid-sentence, Fanny.
what?
It sounded like you got cut off mid-sentence when you muted.
No, I don't think so.
To me as well. Maybe there was a very brief connection interruption just at the end of
Oh,
your
maybe.
sentence.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like a great experiment to run, is to, train an LLM only on really solid, well-vetted research data that points in a certain direction.
What's the Charlie, do you know what's the minimum amount of data that you would need in order to train a model to be able to then process that kind of text?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's vast. But the other way to do it would be to have some sort of background training on lots of data and then have another somehow primarily important training phase on top of it using a smaller amount of data. But I'm just sort of imagining how this might work. I don't have technical information about this being feasible.
I'm also thinking that, training data probably prioritizes, well, obviously will prioritize published academic material in these kind of contexts, even though a lot of an LLM's training data is things like, internet chit chat and this kind of stuff. I'm wondering how we would get actual relevant kind of interview material and thoughtful oral material into the training data so that I suppose I'm just thinking about that academic bias that you were talking about, Charlie, where if something has already been heavily researched, there's more data in the training corpus about it. And the sort of groundbreaking research that people might be doing, it won't be there. It will only be there in their interview data or whatever research they've done. So I
Yeah,
suppose it's like, how do we hear the marginalised voices, which maybe haven't been already absorbed into academia?
It would be interesting to um to see where there are studies that are not part of large and well-known journals that are kind of taking place in places that are normally not included in that sort of thing. So we have our big international journals, but then there'll be presumably local places doing local research that aren't part of those journals. It's interesting. It's hard to say like how much of that actually makes its way into the training data because it's paywalled. So when you talk to ChatGPT, has it actually been trained on the academic research, or has it been trained on the abstracts, which are readily available? So obviously there'll be free archives like Archive that will likely have been included, but will they have everything behind a paywall? Has ChatGPT got access, for example, to Sci-Hub? Did they train ChatGPT on Sci-Hub and other kind of paywall breakers, or or is it all gated? And it's just working on the abstracts, because it would explain quite a lot if it's just working with the abstracts, which might mean that it's almost the worst of both worlds, that you've got maximum amount of data from the sources that are the dominant ones globally, a very small subset of people, but you've only got them on a very superficial level, which sounds very suboptimal.
well, it strikes me that as you outlined so clearly, the process that maybe one of the middle steps could be of value to training LLMs, right? If you take, right, a corpus of interview content and then you get transcripts and you clean up those transcripts and you also select the ones that are not jokes, right, and that are thoughtful, that transcript could, because Vanny was asking about oral, right? But you have an interview, you transcribe it, that can be done automatically. But then if somebody goes through and checks it, right, that stage that's done right before you use it to code, right, to save those transcripts and then use those as fodder for an LLM project, that might be very useful to, rather than to distill it down into research results. Let the original words of the people you're interviewing speak and be part of the training data that some future iteration of an LLM might use more effectively to give us broader coverage and better diversity, and to lean away from that academic bias. And again, it speaks, the other thing I can't help but, as that was brought up, is the original thing that Vanny said that I was responding to, which is that LLMs are really like sort of wanting to focus on talking about AI. And so one of the reasons for that is that if you look on archive right now, right, what are you going to find most papers are being written on? They're written on, trying to build AI in new effective ways. And so if that's what they're all being trained on, of course that's where they're going to lean towards in terms of their responses, because that makes up such a substantial proportion of the larger problem, which is academia in general, right? So a lot of layers here.
Indeed. Yeah, it's really interesting what you were saying about using the transcripts, the kind of checked and cleaned transcripts as fundamental data in the training process, because I was thinking it would be great to have a kind of ethics layer, not even necessarily an ethics model, but a corpus for the purpose of informing AI ethics, especially once we have kind of relatively autonomous AI, having a broad base of direct information or data from people and not just kind of gathered from the internet, which is, everything on the internet has its own purpose. Like even that purpose skews the data because it's for something. A blog is for monetization. It's for informing people about a certain subject. That orientation of informing somebody already changes that. So having a repository of relatively unfiltered insights from the general population, that is where an effort's been made to make that very diverse, I think would be immensely valuable. And it's interesting because we talk about sometimes. So when we initiated this project, I was thinking about specifically what are people's views on AI, and what are their values? What are their values about AI? But actually, when I started thinking about it a bit more deeply, especially in response to some of the information coming in from the data, actually people's values are they're not specific to AI necessarily. People's values are their values, and so actually maybe it's not really that important to know what do we want AI to do. It's how do we want to live our lives? What gives meaning to our lives? What means freedom to us? What are our human values in general? And there have been efforts made to try to map human values, but they're not. There are some quite reasonably developed frameworks out there that try to map human values, but it feels to me like even people who are experts in that field feel the incompleteness of those frameworks. So I do actually see quite a good value if we can somehow provide that sort of data, having it as a data layer, and curating it carefully to make sure that people are properly represented in it, I think that would be immensely valuable, for all sorts of reasons, but especially to inform AI. And once you start doing that, it's also possible to consider how can we ensure that people are properly compensated for their participation? Because when an LLM is trained, well, some of the big corporations have essentially scraped the internet, and there are of course these lawsuits against them for infringement of copyright because they have taken information that they haven't compensated anybody for. So it might even be able to be might even be possible to create a data economy around human values, where data is tagged and people are compensated according to their contribution. So if you have contributed an interview, then that can be attributed. It could be anonymous, it could be like zero knowledge proof associated with you, so that you are able to be compensated without being identified in the data. And I think that would be quite meaningful, especially if it also encourages connections to local communities, and a more equal dialogue.
Yeah, I'm wondering also whether that might be something that you want to, as you go out and do more interviews, add to what you're telling people, that, right, give them an option to check a box. You've consented to let us interview you for this research. Would you also be okay with us using, anonymized your responses as training for some next generation of LLMs, so that you're upfront with people about because Vanny raised a really great point about consent and informed consent and permissions in the chat.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Just to say, it is really difficult with consent on sort of technological areas that are moving quickly. I mean, even as an oral historian, I've done interviews earlier in my career where we had permission forms that say, can we use it for this? Can we use it for that? And we didn't specify, can we use it for the thing that now exists that we would like to use it for? But I'm always a little bit unsure or uncomfortable with consent forms that say, please give us permission to use it however the heck we like, regardless of what might happen. So, yeah, it's always, well, impossible, I would say, to go back to old interviewees and go, oh, can we just revise our consent form with you? So yeah, I think there's a real issue to be worked through about what we tell people about what we're doing with the data. But it would be good to try and think of how to resolve that effectively and ethically.
Well, that's one of the things about ethics is it's challenging. There's no easy way to be ethical, right? You have to like hold yourself accountable to the decisions that you made in the past and the oversights that you had and the fact that you can't predict the future. And so, well, we can add something else now to future interviews. And yeah, it's a drag that there's good data that could be mined if we weren't ethical, and we chose to ignore the fact that, oh yeah, well, it's sort of, they agreed to this, so that's sort of like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we even found this a little bit with our research as well, that there were just purposes that we didn't really think about at the beginning. Do we want to ask permission to put this in an LLM, even if it's not used for training? Or, do we want to, I mean, the human values layer was perhaps an idea that came subsequently, but we didn't really ask, would it be okay to include it in that corpus? It's just the insights. It's interesting. There's all sorts of things that almost immediately start to come up after the fact, and it is always an ethical question. What do you do about that? Do you do you go back? Do you start again with people with a new consent form, knowing that there's always going to be other questions there as well that might come up later? Anyway, I can see that we're at time. We're over time, so I just wanted to ask if there are any final questions that anybody would like to ask before we finish. Thank you so much for coming and for listening.
Just one really quickly, those who are still here, is there interest in another session, like Esther was talking about? Just give us a hands up if you think you might come to one that is like more specifically working on some coding or learning the practicalities a bit more. Okay, good to know. We'll see what we can do about it.
Sounds great. Yeah, it would be nice to expand the research efforts when we're able to. It might not be for a little while that we're able to kind of move into a second phase of research, but it would be wonderful if we were able to continue to collect interviews and transcribe them. So also anybody who's interested in learning how to interview, we do have, I believe, some interview training materials available. So anyone who's interested in that part of the research process can go back to those at any time. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you're as excited about coding as we are. And yeah, looking forward to being able to share the results from the interviews and from the coding. We should be able to, I hope, pretty soon write up some results as a result of what we've been doing. Excited to share that and to see what comes out. Thanks for having us.